October 1943, a Gestapo headquarters in occupied France. A radio sits on the desk of a senior officer, mahogany case gleaming in the afternoon light, standard civilian model, Philips brand, the kind you would find in 10,000 French homes. It had been in the office for 3 days, a gift from a local collaborator seeking favor. The officer turns the dial. Music fills the room. Bach. The officer smiles, adjusts the volume, and leaves to attend a briefing down the hall. 2 minutes later, the radio explodes. The blast tears through the office, collapses part of the ceiling, and kills 3 men in adjacent rooms. German investigators arrive within the hour. They find fragments of the radio case, components of the speaker, pieces of the tuning mechanism. Everything you would expect from a radio destroyed in an explosion. What they do not find, because it no longer exists in recognizable form, is evidence that the radio had been manufactured specifically to explode, that its internal components had been meticulously arranged around nearly a pound of plastic explosive, that the timer mechanism had been set days earlier, counting down with mechanical precision while the officer listened to propaganda broadcasts and classical music. The radio had not been sabotaged. It had been designed from the beginning as a weapon, and the Germans had invited it into their headquarters. The radio looked utterly ordinary. Standard dimensions, correct weight, proper components visible through the speaker grill. Turn it on, and it worked exactly as expected, receiving broadcasts on multiple bands, producing clear audio through functional speakers. Place it on a shelf next to an identical civilian model, and even an experienced radio technician would struggle to identify which one contained explosives. This was deliberate. British Special Operations, executive engineers, and American Office of Strategic Services specialists had spent months perfecting the concealment. They understood that the most dangerous weapons in occupied territories were not the most powerful, but the most overlooked. A bomb that looked like a bomb would be found. A bomb that looked like a radio could sit on a desk for days while its timer counted down. The explosive radio represented the ultimate expression of covert warfare philosophy. No resistance fighter needed to approach the target. No one needed to plant anything under suspicious circumstances. The weapon arrived as a gift, a purchase, an item requisitioned through normal channels. It played music while it waited. Then it exploded. German security forces were trained to find bombs. They searched packages, inspected parcels, examined anything that entered sensitive facilities. But they could not search every object. They could not disassemble every radio, every lamp, every piece of furniture. The explosive radio exploited this fundamental security limitation. It hid in plain sight, protected by the assumption that functional everyday objects could not simultaneously be weapons. For the Allies, the explosive radio was more than just another sabotage tool. It was psychological warfare. Every explosion from an unsuspected object created paranoia that spread far beyond the immediate casualties. If radios could explode, what else might be rigged? The telephone? The desk lamp? The typewriter? Trust in ordinary objects eroded. Security procedures became burdensome. Officers grew paranoid. The operational cost of that paranoia exceeded the physical damage of any individual explosion. This was British engineering at its most devious. This was how you fought when you could not send bombers. This was warfare by deception, and the radio bomb might have been its most elegant expression. If you're finding this fascinating, hit that subscribe button. It helps more than you know. And comment below where you're watching from. Now, let's explore why the Allies desperately needed this weapon. To understand why Allied intelligence needed explosive radios, you must understand the challenge of conducting sabotage operations in occupied Europe. By 1942, German security had become sophisticated. The Gestapo, SS, and Wehrmacht security divisions had developed comprehensive protocols for identifying threats. They understood that resistance movements relied on sabotage, They knew explosives were being smuggled into occupied territories. They knew agents were operating behind enemy lines. Checkpoints searched travelers. Random inspections targeted suspicious individuals. Buildings housing German personnel were subject to regular security sweeps. The Germans were not stupid. They were thorough, organized, and increasingly experienced in identifying sabotage attempts. Conventional bombs faced immediate problems. Plastic explosive could be concealed, but delivering it to a target required getting past security. An agent carrying a package into a German headquarters would be questioned. A mysterious parcel arriving through the mail would be inspected. Any object that appeared designed to contain explosives invited scrutiny that usually ended with discovery and arrest. Time-delayed bombs using mechanical timers could be planted, but the planning itself represented enormous risk. Resistance operatives had to gain access to sensitive areas, hide the device, and escape before detonation. Every step multiplied the chances of detection. Casualties among saboteurs were catastrophic. For every successful operation, multiple agents were captured, interrogated, and executed. The core problem was this: how do you introduce explosives into heavily secured locations without arousing suspicion? The specification seemed impossible. The device had to contain enough explosive to cause meaningful damage. It had to survive inspection by trained security personnel. It had to have a reliable detonation mechanism that could not be accidentally triggered. Most critically, it had to look so completely innocent that no one would consider examining it closely. Allied planners recognized an additional dimension to the problem. Beyond physical sabotage, they needed to create psychological impact. German officers in occupied territories lived with routine dangers: resistance attacks, sabotage, partisan operations. They adapted to these threats with security measures and vigilance. But what if everyday objects became threats? What if the radio on your desk, the lamp on your table, the clock on your wall might explode without warning? That kind of paranoia could not be countered with security protocols. It was ambient, pervasive, and deeply unsettling. It degraded operational effectiveness in ways that were difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. Officers who feared their own office equipment would be distracted, stressed, and less effective. The specification came into focus. Create a weapon that was simultaneously functional and lethal, that could pass as a legitimate civilian object while containing sufficient explosive to kill its target, that could be delivered through normal channels without triggering security responses, and that would create lasting psychological effects extending far beyond individual attacks. British engineers at SOE's specialized facilities looked at this impossible specification and decided it was achievable. The solution would require precision manufacturing, creative engineering, and meticulous attention to detail. It would also require rethinking what a bomb could look like. The development of the explosive radio began at SOE Station Lothian, a research facility at Aston House in Hertfordshire, and Station 9, the primary development facility at the Frythe near Welwyn Garden City. These were Britain's secret weapons laboratories, where engineers and technicians developed the tools of covert warfare. Major Charles Clark and Captain Christopher Clayton Hutton led the team responsible for camouflage devices. They understood that concealment was not merely about hiding something, but about making it unworthy of suspicion. A hidden bomb might be found through thorough searching. A bomb disguised as a functioning device would likely never be examined at all. The team began with selection of the radio model. This decision was critical. The radio had to be common enough that its presence would not seem unusual, but not so distinctive that variations in weight or dimensions would be noticed. They settled on several models of civilian radios popular in Europe during the late 1930s and early 1940s. Philips, Telefunken, and similar manufacturers produced units that were widely distributed and visually familiar. Acquiring legitimate radios for conversion presented the first challenge. SOE could not simply manufacture fake radios. That would require duplicating too many components and would risk producing units that looked slightly wrong to anyone familiar with the genuine article. Instead, they purchased or otherwise obtained actual civilian radios, then modified them. The modification process required extraordinary precision. Engineers first carefully disassembled each radio, cataloging every component. They needed to maintain the radio's functionality while creating space for explosives. This meant some internal components had to be rearranged or miniaturized. Capacitors might be repositioned. Wiring could be made more compact. The speaker could be made slightly thinner without noticeably affecting sound quality. The explosive itself was plastic explosive, typically a mixture including RDX and a plasticizer. The quantity had to be carefully calculated. Too little and the explosion would be inadequate. Too much and the additional weight would make the radio noticeably heavier than a standard model. Engineers settled on amounts typically ranging from 10 to 16 ounces, enough to kill anyone in the immediate vicinity and cause significant structural damage to a room. Placement of the explosive was an art. It had to fill available internal space efficiently without interfering with the radio's operation. Engineers molded the explosive into custom shapes that fit around vacuum tubes, transformers, and other components. The explosive was typically placed in the rear portion of the case, where it would be less likely to be noticed if someone casually examined the radio's internals through the speaker grill or ventilation holes. The detonator and timer mechanism represented the greatest engineering challenge. The device had to be reliable, resistant to accidental triggering, and small enough to conceal within the radio's case. Multiple triggering options were developed. The most common was a clockwork timer, similar to mechanisms used in conventional alarm clocks, but modified for silent operation. The timer could be set for delays ranging from hours to days, allowing the radio to be placed well before detonation. Some variants used radio frequency activation. These models could be triggered remotely when a specific frequency was received, though this approach was less common due to the risk of accidental detonation from stray radio signals. Other variants used anti-handling devices that would trigger the explosive if the radio was moved after a certain period or if specific internal switches were disturbed. Weight matching was critical. A standard radio might weigh between 8 and 15 pounds depending on the model. The explosive radio had to match this weight precisely. If the added weight of explosives and timer mechanisms made the radio noticeably heavier, suspicion would follow. Engineers used lightweight components where possible and sometimes removed non-essential parts to compensate for the explosive's weight. The radio had to remain fully functional. This was not optional. A radio that did not work would immediately be examined or discarded. Engineers ensured that every explosive radio could receive broadcasts, produce sound, and appear completely normal in operation. The detonation mechanism was isolated from the electronic components to prevent any interference or premature triggering. External appearance received fanatical attention to detail. The case had to show appropriate wear for a used civilian radio. Brand new radios in occupied territories would arouse suspicion. Engineers artificially aged the cases, adding minor scratches, slight discoloration, and wear patterns consistent with normal use. Serial numbers, manufacturer stamps, and internal labels all had to be correct for the model being replicated. Testing occurred at specialized facilities, where prototypes were subjected to rigorous evaluation. Each unit was dropped from various heights to ensure the detonation mechanism would not trigger prematurely. The radios were exposed to temperature variations, humidity, and vibration to verify reliability. Timers were tested for accuracy. Detonators were verified. Only units that passed every test were approved for operational use. The final product was a masterpiece of covert engineering. A functional radio that could sit on a desk, play music, withstand casual inspection, and then detonate with lethal force at a predetermined time. The Germans could search it, test it, even use it, and they would find nothing suspicious until the moment it exploded. Production of explosive radios remained necessarily limited. These were not mass-manufactured weapons, but precision instruments, each one requiring skilled technicians and substantial time to complete. Estimates suggest several hundred units were produced between 1942 and 1945, though exact figures remain classified or lost to incomplete records. The devices were manufactured at several SOE workshops, with Station Booth and Station 9 handling the majority of production. American OSS facilities in the United States also produced variants following British designs, adapting the concept to radio models common in different regions. Training operatives to deploy explosive radios required specialized instruction. Agents learned not just how to set the timer, but how to behave around the device to avoid arousing suspicion. The radio had to be treated as a normal radio. Carry it naturally. Place it carefully, but not gingerly. Do not act as though it is dangerous because that behavior itself would betray the device. Cover stories were essential. Why did this agent have a radio? Where did it come from? Why was it being delivered to this particular location? The cover story had to be plausible and verifiable. Common scenarios included a gift from a grateful local to a German officer. The officer had helped the local with some administrative matter, and the radio was offered as thanks. The local was actually a resistance sympathizer, but the officer did not know this. A requisitioned item brought in through normal procurement channels. Military and civilian administrators in occupied territories regularly obtained furniture, equipment, and household items for German facilities. A radio might be acquired from a local shop, confiscated from a Jewish household, or transferred from another location. Paperwork could be forged to make the transaction appear legitimate. A personal possession of a new staff member. When officers or clerks transferred to a new posting, they brought personal items including radios. A resistance sympathizer joining a German administrative office might bring an explosive radio as part of their household goods. Distribution to resistance networks occurred through multiple channels. RAF Special Operations flights dropped containers with explosive radios along with conventional weapons and supplies. Couriers transported them through established smuggling routes. In some cases, they were delivered through seemingly legitimate commercial channels, with SOE agents posing as merchants or suppliers. The radios came with detailed instructions, typically written on rice paper that could be quickly destroyed if necessary. The instructions explained how to set the timer, how to behave around the device, and what cover stories to use. Operatives were warned never to reveal the true nature of the radio to anyone who did not need to know. Security protocols were strict. The resistance operative delivering the radio often did not know it was a bomb. They believed they were delivering a normal radio, possibly containing some hidden intelligence documents or a concealed radio transmitter. This protected the overall operation. If the courier was captured and interrogated, they could honestly claim ignorance of the explosive content. The actual timer would be set by a specialized operative immediately before delivery, or by the resistance cell leader receiving the device. Setting the timer required accessing the interior of the radio, adjusting the mechanism, and then sealing the case. This process took only minutes but had to be done carefully to avoid leaving evidence of tampering. The first documented use of an explosive radio occurred in France in late 1942 or early 1943, though the fragmentary nature of SOE records makes precise dating difficult. The target was a German administrative building in Lyon, where occupation authorities coordinated control of the surrounding region. A resistance operative working as a clerk in the building brought a radio as a personal item. The radio sat on a desk in a common area for 5 days, playing French and German broadcasts, while the timer counted down. The explosion killed 2 German officers and wounded several others. More importantly, it destroyed filing cabinets containing records of suspected resistance members and planned security operations. The resistance lost valuable intelligence about German knowledge of their networks, but the immediate disruption of German planning was deemed worth the cost. German investigators found evidence of the explosion's origin in the radio fragments, but this discovery provided little useful information. How had the radio entered the building? Who had modified it? Where had the explosive come from? The answers led nowhere. The clerk who had brought the radio had been in the building legitimately for months and was as surprised by the explosion as anyone, or so their performance suggested. A second operation targeted a German officer's quarters in Brussels. The scenario was elegantly simple. A Belgian woman working as a housekeeper for German officers brought a radio to replace one that had broken. She explained that her cousin had a radio to sell and the officers could purchase it at a fair price. The officers examined the radio, found it functional and reasonably priced, and agreed to the purchase. The radio played music in the officers' common room for 2 days. Then it detonated during dinner, killing 4 officers and injuring 3 more. The explosion also destroyed a strategic planning map that had been left on a nearby table. The housekeeper had left employment 2 days earlier, citing a family emergency. She was never found. The psychological effect of these attacks extended far beyond the casualties. German security forces realized they faced a threat they could not easily counter. Every object in occupied facilities became suspect. Radios were obvious targets for additional scrutiny, but so were lamps, clocks, furniture, and decorative items. Security protocols expanded to include inspection of all items entering German facilities. But this created its own problems. Thoroughly inspecting every radio meant partially disassembling it, a time-consuming process requiring technical expertise. German forces did not have unlimited specialists available. Civilian radios were common in occupied territories. German personnel wanted entertainment and connection to German broadcasts. Banning all radios would harm morale. Inspecting every radio was impractical. The paranoia created operational inefficiencies that intelligence analysts later estimated were more damaging than the direct casualties from explosive radios. Officers hesitated before accepting gifts. Administrative delays increased as security checks expanded. Trust in local populations further degraded. The mere possibility that any object might explode created ambient stress that affected decision-making and morale. Eastern European resistance networks received explosive radios and deployed them with particular effectiveness. In Poland, a radio was delivered to a German security office through a complex operation involving forged requisition papers. The radio was supposed to replace equipment damaged in a partisan raid. It was accepted without question and placed in a commander's office. 3 days later, it exploded during a briefing, killing the commander and 2 intelligence officers. Not all operations succeeded. Some explosive radios were discovered during routine inspections. The sophistication of German security varied by location and personnel. A particularly alert security officer in Norway noticed that a newly acquired radio seemed slightly heavier than expected. Careful examination revealed the concealed explosive. The discovery led to increased scrutiny of radios across the region, and probably prevented several planned operations. Other times, detonation mechanisms failed. Clockwork timers, while generally reliable, could fail due to manufacturing defects, temperature extremes, or rough handling during transport. A radio that failed to explode became a security risk. If discovered and examined, it would reveal Allied techniques and could lead to the capture of the resistance members involved in its deployment. The Allies considered these failures acceptable costs. Every successful explosion justified the program. Every instance of German paranoia over everyday objects represented a strategic victory. The explosive radio achieved its purpose not through massive casualty counts, but through sustained psychological pressure and occasional devastating strikes against key personnel. Operator testimonies, recorded after the war, reveal the emotional complexity of deploying these weapons. One French resistance member described the experience of watching German officers use a radio for several days, knowing it would soon explode. The moral weight was significant. These were men going about their duties, listening to music, unaware that they were sitting next to a bomb, that they were occupation forces, complicit in brutal repression, provided some justification. But the deception remained unsettling. The explosive radio represented a form of warfare that violated traditional notions of honor. There was no battlefield, no warning, no chance for the enemy to fight back. It was assassination by deception, and it worked precisely because it exploited trust in ordinary objects. That made it effective. It also made it deeply uncomfortable for many involved in its deployment. The explosive radio was not the only camouflaged weapon developed during World War II, but it represented perhaps the most sophisticated application of the concealment philosophy. British SOE engineers created an entire catalog of innocent-looking deadly objects. The explosive coal was another famous example. Lumps of explosive cast to resemble coal, designed to be shoveled into locomotive fireboxes where they would explode and destroy the boiler. Explosive rats, actual rat carcasses stuffed with explosives, were designed to be left in enemy facilities where they might be thrown into furnaces, causing explosions. The Americans developed similar devices through OSS. They created explosive tire repair kits, fountain pens that fired poison darts, and cigarette packs containing small cameras. The creative application of concealment technology was extensive, but the explosive radio stood apart for several reasons. First, its functionality as a genuine radio meant it could be used for days or weeks before detonation. The coal had to explode on first use. The rat was a one-time device. The radio could sit on a desk, playing music, fully integrated into daily life, while it waited. Second, the radio's complexity demonstrated extraordinary engineering. Making a lump of coal-shaped explosive was relatively simple. Making a functional radio that also contained explosives, a timer, and a detonator, all while maintaining correct weight and appearance, required precision manufacturing and sophisticated technical knowledge. The Germans developed some camouflaged weapons, but generally focused on different aspects of covert warfare. They used hidden microphones and cameras more extensively than explosive devices. German intelligence seemed to prefer intelligence gathering over sabotage through deception. This philosophical difference reflected broader strategic priorities and operational doctrines. Why did radios specifically work so well? Several factors converged. Radios were common in occupied territories. German personnel actively wanted radios for entertainment and propaganda reception. The devices were complex enough that non-experts would not typically examine their internals. They were heavy enough that a pound of explosive could be concealed without making the total weight suspicious. They contained numerous components among which a timer mechanism could be hidden. Other household objects lacked these advantages. A lamp was too simple. Inspection would reveal anomalies. A clock's internals were too visible. A typewriter was too mechanical. Adding explosives would interfere with function. The radio occupied a sweet spot of complexity, commonality, and utility that made it ideal for concealment. The Japanese theater saw limited use of explosive radios. The Pacific War's geography and the nature of Japanese occupation created different operational requirements. Island fortifications were more important targets than administrative buildings. The submarine and air supply lines that supported European resistance were less developed in Asia. Some explosive radios were produced for operations in China and Southeast Asia, but documentation is sparse. The comparative assessment reveals that the explosive radio succeeded because it aligned technical sophistication with operational requirements. In occupied Europe, resistance movements needed ways to strike German targets without sacrificing operatives. The explosive radio provided that capability. Its success encouraged continued development of camouflaged weapons throughout the war. The explosive radio, despite its sophistication, faced significant limitations that constrained its operational use. Technical reliability was imperfect. Clockwork timers, though tested extensively, sometimes failed. Temperature variations affected metal components, potentially speeding up or slowing down the mechanism. This meant an explosion might occur hours earlier or later than planned, potentially killing the wrong people or missing the target entirely. Humid conditions in tropical regions could corrode electrical components, causing the radio to stop functioning and thereby inviting inspection that might reveal the explosive. The weight limitation restricted explosive capacity. 10 to 16 ounces of plastic explosive was enough to kill people in close proximity, but insufficient to destroy large structures. An explosive radio could eliminate key personnel or destroy documents in a single room, but it could not collapse a building or destroy significant military hardware. The weapon was tactical, not strategic. Detection methods improved as the war progressed. German security forces, after several incidents, developed protocols for examining radios more carefully. Some units began X-raying suspicious items, which would reveal unusual internal configurations. Others used dogs trained to detect explosives, though this was less effective against the small quantities concealed in radios. The most reliable detection method remained physical inspection by skilled technicians, which, while time-consuming, became more common at high-security facilities. The ethical implications were complex and troubling. Explosive radios represented weapons that killed through deception. There was no warning, no way for the target to fight back or defend themselves. This violated traditional concepts of honorable warfare, even if such concepts were already badly degraded by the realities of World War II. More troubling was the risk to civilians. A radio intended for a German officer might end up in a different location. It might be given to a civilian, stolen, or sold. The timer, once set, would detonate regardless of who was present. While efforts were made to target specific individuals in specific locations, the nature of the weapon meant collateral damage was always possible. Post-war assessment of explosive radio effectiveness is difficult. Casualty figures are incomplete. Many operations were never documented. Success was measured not just in people killed, but in psychological impact and operational disruption, effects that are hard to quantify. Intelligence analysts generally concluded the program was worthwhile, but this assessment is based on fragmentary evidence. The explosive radio's legacy extends into Cold War and modern covert operations. The principle of concealing weapons in everyday objects remained central to intelligence agency methodology. Letter bombs, package bombs, and improvised explosive devices concealed in consumer electronics all trace their conceptual lineage to World War II camouflaged weapons. Modern security protocols reflect lessons learned from explosive radios. X-ray screening of packages, explosive detection systems, and the general suspicion of items at security checkpoints all derive partially from the realization that any object can potentially contain a weapon. The TSA regulations prohibiting certain items on aircraft, the security screening at government buildings, the bomb-sniffing dogs at public events, all these measures exist partly because of weapons like the explosive radio. Museum collections preserve examples of SOE camouflaged weapons, including explosive radios. The Imperial War Museum in London displays several, deactivated and preserved as historical artifacts. These devices serve as reminders of the extraordinary ingenuity applied to warfare and the moral complexity inherent in combat operations. The men and women who designed, built, and deployed explosive radios lived with knowledge of what their work entailed. Some later expressed pride in the technical sophistication achieved. Others questioned whether the ends justified the means. Most acknowledged that war creates situations where conventional morality becomes difficult to apply, and choices must be made based on incomplete information and under extreme pressure. October 1943. A Gestapo headquarters in occupied France. A radio sits on a desk, playing Bach. The officer has left the room. In 90 seconds, the timer will complete its countdown. The spring will release. The detonator will fire. The plastic explosive will detonate. The radio was never sabotaged. It was designed from the beginning to do exactly this. British engineers had spent months perfecting the concealment. They had matched the weight, verified the functionality, tested the timer mechanism, and ensured that the device could pass inspection by trained security personnel. The Germans had invited it into their headquarters because it looked harmless, because it was a radio and radios were ordinary, because it played music and received broadcasts and seemed completely normal. The genius of the explosive radio was that it was normal, until suddenly it was not. This was what happened when engineering creativity met operational necessity. When you could not send bombers, you sent radios. When you could not assault fortifications directly, you hid explosives inside everyday objects. When conventional warfare proved too costly, you fought with deception. The explosive radio represented more than technical sophistication. It represented a fundamental shift in how wars could be fought. The battlefield was not just France and Belgium and Poland. It was every room where a radio played, every office where officers worked, every headquarters where plans were made. Nowhere was truly safe. Nothing was entirely trustworthy. The paranoia created by that realization was itself a weapon. That was British engineering in 1943. That was how you fought when you were outgunned, outmanned, and operating behind enemy lines. That was warfare by deception, and the radio bomb was its perfect expression. An innocent object that killed without warning, a functional device that was simultaneously a weapon, a gift that exploded in your face. The officer in occupied France never knew. The radio played Bach until the moment it vaporized, and somewhere in Britain, engineers were already working on the next innocent object that would kill when no one expected it.